I don't remember the exact moment I became my mother's caretaker. It just happened, piece by piece, each small responsibility sliding into place until I barely noticed it was my life that had shifted. Moving back home had been temporary, or so I told myself then. I was between jobs, and Mom had started having issues with her heart. She'd always been independent, but this was different. I could see it in the way she'd linger at the bottom of the stairs or the slight tremble in her hand when she poured her tea. She needed someone. In those early days, it didn't seem like a sacrifice. I was her daughter. After all, if anyone was going to help her, it should be me. And besides, I thought I'd find something here, a job in town or maybe a remote position that would allow me to continue pursuing my dreams without moving away. But as time passed, the weight of caregiving began to settle on my shoulders, becoming heavier with every new doctor's appointment, every new medication schedule. My career took a backseat, everything did. My younger brother, Mark, seemed supportive at first. He had his own life in the city, working in finance, visiting Mom every now and then on weekends or holidays. He'd say how proud he was of me, taking care of her. It made me feel a bit better, as if his approval somehow validated what I was doing. But deep down, I resented him. Not for his success, I was happy he'd found his path, but for his freedom. He could go back to his life while I stayed behind, feeling the walls of our family home close in around me. I convinced myself that this was temporary, a chapter in my life that would eventually end. Surely, when the time was right, I'd step back into the world and reclaim my dreams. But that was before I received the call that would change everything. The call came one chilly autumn morning. An old friend from college had seen my resume on a job board and thought of me for a role in her company, a position that aligned perfectly with my background and long-forgotten ambitions. It was a small firm but respected, and the job offered a balance of challenge and stability I hadn't experienced in years. As I listened to her describe the role, excitement stirred in me, a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. This was a chance to restart my career, to take back the life I'd put on hold. I could already see myself moving to the city, renting an apartment, setting up my own routines. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. After hanging up, I sat in silence, letting the thrill of the opportunity sink in. But as the excitement faded, reality crept back in. Taking this job would mean leaving Mom. I'd need to find someone to look after her, someone I could trust. I thought about hiring an in-home caregiver or perhaps arranging for her to stay at a care facility. These were conversations I'd put off for too long, avoiding the hard truth that she needed more help than I could give her alone. When I told Mark about the job, he didn't seem as excited as I'd hoped. He nodded along, saying he understood, but there was a hesitation in his voice, an undertone that I couldn't quite place. He asked if I'd really thought it through, whether I was ready to leave Mom alone. I assured him I'd make arrangements, but his words planted a seed of doubt in my mind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that he simply didn't understand how much I needed this. The job interview was scheduled for the following week, and as the days passed, I felt a blend of anticipation and guilt. Part of me worried about what it would mean to leave, but another part, maybe a selfish part, knew that this was a path I needed to take, even if it meant stepping away from the role of caregiver that had defined me for so long. The days leading up to the interview felt tense. I tried to stay focused, reading up on the company, practicing my responses to interview questions, but every time I sat down to prepare, I found myself distracted by doubts. Could I really manage a job and care for Mom? What if she needed something and I wasn't there? When Mark called that evening, he seemed unusually chatty. He asked how I was feeling about the interview, whether I was nervous. I told him I was. A little. But I was ready for this. I wanted this. He paused, then asked if I thought I'd be able to adjust to a new life. I could hear the hint of skepticism in his voice, and it gnawed at me. What if something happened to Mom while you're away? Are you really comfortable with that? I told him I'd have to be, that I couldn't keep putting my life on hold indefinitely. But his words stuck with me. Each time I thought about the interview, I heard his voice in my mind, questioning my decision. I could see Mom, frail and alone, waiting by the phone. My confidence wavered. Mom also seemed to sense something was going on. She asked more questions than usual about where I was going and who would take care of her. It was as if she'd suddenly realized I might not always be there. Her questions sounded innocent, but they added to the guilt that was already building in me. It wasn't until later that I realized how deeply Mark's words had affected me. How each subtle comment had eroded my resolve bit by bit. His concern for Mom had seemed genuine, But there was an undertone I hadn't picked up on then, a subtle manipulation that I was only beginning to understand. As I walked into the building where my interview was being held, I could feel a mix of excitement and dread swirling inside me. I took a deep breath, smoothing my blouse and trying to calm my mind. This was my moment, a chance to reclaim a part of myself I'd nearly forgotten. But as I sat down across from the interviewer, something in me felt strangely unsteady, like I was on the edge of slipping. The questions started simple, about my background and experience. Yet each one seemed to pull me further away from the confidence I'd felt before. I stammered through my responses, my mind drifting back to Mark's words. "Are you sure you want to leave her alone?" I could almost hear him asking. His voice echoed in my head, and each echo dug deeper, undermining me in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. My responses became disjointed, my words losing clarity. I could feel the interviewer watching me, a slight crease in his brow that only heightened my anxiety. I tried to focus, but Mark's voice persisted, a quiet reminder of all the reasons I'd convinced myself I couldn't have a life of my own. I answered his questions awkwardly, missing crucial details, my mind swimming with thoughts of what might happen if Mom needed something while I was gone. The final question came, "Why do you want this job?" I opened my mouth, but the answer didn't come. I had practiced for this, rehearsed my reasons a dozen times. But standing there, my ambitions felt thin, fragile against the heavy sense of guilt gnawing at me. I managed to say something, though I barely remembered what it was. And the interviewer's polite but detached nod was all I needed to know I'd failed. As I left the building, shame and anger twisted inside me. I felt like I'd been robbed not just of this opportunity but of the confidence that had once defined me. I blamed myself, but I also blamed Mark for his subtle manipulation, for every small comment that had quietly chipped away at my self-worth. I wanted to believe he had my best interests at heart, but something in his words had felt wrong, calculated even. The disappointment was crushing, and I wondered if maybe he'd succeeded in keeping me exactly where he wanted me. Back home, the weight of the interview's failure lingered. I spent hours going over every question, every response, each one feeling more inadequate than the last. But as the days passed, my frustration shifted. I found myself returning to conversations with Mark, replaying his words and tone in my mind. I began to realize that what I'd once considered support had, in subtle ways, been a form of control. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's influence had gone deeper than I'd realized. Out of curiosity and perhaps a desperate need to make sense of things, I reached out to a mutual friend, Sarah. She'd known both of us for years, and her sympathy was immediate as I described what had happened. But then she said something that struck me. "You know, Mark talks about how you're really settled, taking care of your mom. He made it sound like you'd found your calling." Her words hit me like a punch. Settled, calling. I hadn't settled, I'd taken on a role that circumstances had forced upon me. And this was certainly not my calling, it was a responsibility. A duty I'd accepted out of love, but not a purpose I'd chosen. As I dug deeper, other small details started to emerge. Friends mentioned that Mark had been very vocal about how grateful he was that I was there for Mom. How he was so glad he could rely on me to take care of her. Each comment stung, as if he'd been painting a picture of me that suited his own needs. A version of me that was content to remain in this role forever. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Mark had subtly positioned me as the permanent caregiver. The one who would stay while he continued his own life unhindered. He'd been orchestrating this narrative, framing me as the dutiful daughter while he went about his business, free from the responsibilities I'd shouldered. I felt betrayed, not just by Mark but by myself, for letting his manipulation go unnoticed for so long. I'd allowed him to mold me into the person he needed me to be, sacrificing my own dreams along the way. My anger simmered, a quiet, gnawing rage that kept me up at night. I wanted to confront Mark, to let him know that I saw through his carefully crafted narrative. I wanted him to see the pain he'd caused, to feel the frustration and helplessness he'd inflicted on me by trapping me in this role. But every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. Mark was a master at deflecting blame, turning any conversation into a reminder of his own sacrifices. I knew he'd twist my words, make it sound as though I were ungrateful for everything he'd done, as though I were the one abandoning Mom for selfish reasons. I put the phone down, realizing that a confrontation would only fuel his sense of righteousness. He'd use it as further proof that I couldn't handle the situation, that I was letting everyone down. I needed to find another way to free myself from this role. Not through his approval or by winning an argument, but by reclaiming my own agency. In the quiet of my room, I made a decision. I would step away, with or without his support. I didn't need his permission to live my own life. I had spent too many years defining myself through other people's expectations, shaping my life around roles others needed me to fill. If I was going to break free, it had to be for myself, with a renewed sense of purpose. I started researching care options for Mom. I spent hours poring over in-home care services, reading reviews, and making calls to local care facilities. Each call was an act of defiance, a small victory against the narrative that had held me captive for so long. I would find a way to take care of Mom without sacrificing myself in the process. The first few calls were disheartening. The cost of care was higher than I'd anticipated, and some services had long waiting lists. But I pressed on, determined to make this work. I found a local agency that offered part-time in-home care, with flexible hours that would allow me to transition into my new life without abandoning her. Setting these plans in motion filled me with a strange blend of pride and sadness. I was creating a future for myself, yet each step felt like a farewell to the identity I'd worn for so long. I was no longer the full-time caregiver, I was becoming something else. Someone I hadn't been in years. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I arranged for the caregiver to start within the month. It was a modest plan, not a complete handover but a stepping stone, a way to ease both Mom and me into this new arrangement. I knew she would struggle with the change, and a part of me worried that she would see it as a betrayal. But I reminded myself that this wasn't about abandoning her, it was about finding a balance that allowed both of us to live with dignity. The day I left was filled with an overwhelming mix of emotions. I'd packed my bags, set up everything with the caregiver, and explained to Mom that I would be taking on a new job. One that would require me to be away more often. She was quieter than usual, a small frown creasing her brow as she nodded, her fingers tapping anxiously on the table. I could see her struggle, the worry in her eyes. And for a moment, I almost reconsidered, but I reminded myself that I deserved this chance. That this was not a goodbye, only a new beginning. As I drove away from our house, a flood of memories came rushing back, days spent caring for her, nights worrying about her health, and all the small sacrifices I'd made over the years. I realized that these memories were a part of me, scars that would stay with me even as I moved forward. They weren't wounds anymore. They were reminders of the strength I'd found in myself, the resilience I'd uncovered in the face of doubt and manipulation. I thought of Mark and the role he played in shaping this journey. There was a bitterness there, an ache that might never fully heal. But I also understood that forgiveness, in some form, would be necessary for my own peace. I didn't need to excuse his actions, but I also didn't need to let them define my future. As the city skyline came into view, a sense of freedom washed over me, a feeling that had been absent from my life for so long. I was stepping into a world of possibilities, no longer tethered to expectations that weren't my own. I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges, doubts, and perhaps even moments of regret. But this time, every decision would be mine to make. In the weeks that followed, I settled into my new routine, gradually finding my footing in a world that felt both foreign and exhilarating. I discovered a resilience I hadn't known I possessed, a quiet strength that had been forged through years of caregiving and sacrifice. I was no longer defined by my role as a daughter or a caretaker. I was finally, and fully, myself. Looking back, I understood that this journey had been necessary, that the pain and struggle had shaped me in ways I hadn't expected. I carried the lessons of loyalty, love, and independence with me, each one a testament to the resilience that had brought me here. I would carry these scars with pride, reminders of the strength I'd found in reclaiming my life.